Salut! Ça va? In this video, I'm sharing a story about how I learned French. Now, I want this to be as useful as possible for you, so be sure to stay until the end and you'll learn everything from my favourite tools to learn the language, what I would do differently, what worked, what didn't work, all of that good stuff. And I have a free training for you to help you take your language learning even further. So it's called How to Find Time to Learn a Language Even When You're Crazy Busy, and you can sign up at the link in the description below or visit lindsaydoeslanguages.com/find time. Okay, you ready? Let's get into this. French is the language that's been in my life the longest, apart from English, of course, and therefore it's one that I sort of feel maybe I've taken for granted, but it is one that I've taken all the way up to degree level. So it started for me back in primary school, and I went to French club. I was like 8, 9, maybe 10 years old. It was about 1998, and I kept going to French club because they gave us croissants at the end of term, so it was reason enough to stick around. We played loads of games, we learned some words, but in a fun way. And I think this is something that I've always took through with me when I've been learning languages, is that it needs to be fun. And part of the reason for that is that when I then left primary school and went on to secondary school, I was still learning French, but we were basically starting from scratch. So there's like a room full of 30, 11-year-olds. No one really cares. Everyone's like, I'm not going to go to France on holiday. I'm going to go to Spain instead, right? So no one cared about learning French, but I also didn't really care because I'd already done the stuff that I was being taught for the next 2 years. So that made it quite difficult to kind of find a love for the language initially. Then in the third year of secondary school, so year 9, we then got put into different groups, right? So adjusted for like ability a little bit more. So I was lucky enough to be in the top set, which meant we had I don't want to say better teacher, that's unfair, but a teacher who was teaching a top set class. So we also, more than a better teacher, we also had a better class, right? And that made a big difference as well. So I then began to see, you know what, I'm actually quite good at this thing. It's not just a fluke of like coasting through the last 2 years on what I already knew from primary school. I actually do understand this stuff a bit more. And that really helped me then when I wanted to pick my GCSE options to pick French, because I wanted to do Spanish. And to do Spanish, my school said, well, you have to do French to prove that you can learn a language. So I was like, you know what, that's not really a big problem because I can do this thing. So let's just keep going. And then, you know, throughout all of this time, like I'd been kind of traveling to France ever since I was little. We'd go camping in France. And then when I was doing like secondary school stuff, I did 2 French exchanges as well. So I went to France for a week, and then a few months later, they came to stay with me for a week. That, you know, like an exchange like that you do at school. And that was really good because then I was living with a French family. They were speaking French like 90% of the time. And I remember one time going to the market on a Saturday morning with the French mum of the French family I was staying with, and she had like an actual wicker basket that she took to get all the things, and it just felt really different to what life was like in England at that time as well. So that was really, really interesting, both in terms of helping to get better at the language, but also helping to understand more about at least part of where this language exists and where this language comes from. So again, the same thing kind of happened when I went to pick my A-level options a bit later on, in that I wanted to do Spanish more than I wanted to do French. But I think by this point I'd probably accepted that it was a better skill to have multiple languages than to just have one. And so I kept going with French at A-level as well. So 2 more years of like school study. And then after that, I also, in that time I went to Caen in the north of France, not like Cannes, the film festival place, in Normandy. And I did a week's work experience when I was doing my A-levels in a cinema. And again, that experience of being there and like working, quote unquote, was very helpful. Like I would stand at the top of the stairs. This cinema had stairs, so it had a ticket office downstairs like you see in American films, and then there were stairs taking you up, and then I would stand at the top of those stairs and guide people into the right salle, right, the right cinema rooms. Obviously a lot of the language was the same, right, like the second room on the left, turn right, and all the way to the end, salle 8, enjoy your film. You know, that kind of stuff was very repetitive, but it was good. It was really, really good and really helpful. So that was a great experience as well. So, you know, there were these moments of going to France and being more immersed than you would just be on a holiday that I think I wouldn't have necessarily had I learned French later in life and just decided to do it on my own. So when it came to the point of picking my degree and what I wanted to focus on, French and Spanish was the obvious choice by this time. And I wasn't having to make a decision based on wanting to do Spanish more than French by this point, because I was beginning to find, you know, films, like with A-level we had to write about film and stuff, so I was really into, not like really into, but like I wrote about the French New Wave and like Jean-Luc Godard and all of that stuff that like you learn for the first time at that kind of age when you're learning French, and then that really helped then to give me like more of a cultural connection, more of a reason to want to keep learning than just, well, it might be useful, you know? So that was really helpful. And I'm a big advocate for that, you know? Whatever language you're learning, I think if you have a sort of more of a deeper cultural connection, it's often cultural than just, yeah, it might be good to get a job. That's not going to be motivating enough for most people to learn a language to a decent level. But having some kind of passion, like embroidered into all of that, is going to be much more beneficial and much better for long-term motivation. So up until this point, in terms of how I learned French, it was basically school. It was basically doing what I was told to, right? Being given the textbook and following that through with a teacher kind of guiding me. That was the general kind of how I learnt up until then. But then when I started my degree, it was a bit different. I was doing part-time distance learning. I did my degree with the Open University, and I was more responsible for how I was learning. And so with French, French was one of the first languages that I learnt self-study because of that, you know? So it really taught me a lot that has followed through into everything I've done since, in every language that I've learned since. And French was a big part of that at the beginning, and a big solid part of that as well, because it was a language that I was stronger in and that I had more experience with. It felt more like I was allowed to play with my methods because I was stronger in the language. Does that make sense? So yeah, lots of self-study, lots as well at this point, lots of grammar repetition, lots of grammar drills, right? I think I still have on my shelf some of these like grammar drills where you just have like, okay, we're going to talk about ER verbs in present tense, regular ones, and you just lots of that stuff at this point, which is very tedious on the one hand, but also very useful on the other hand. So I made sure that I was keeping up with that. And like I say, finding those cultural connections. At my degree, I was writing about, I remember I did one essay about like Francophone music. So I wrote about like Francophone music more, you know, beyond just France. And I remember Tikan Jafakoli was like a really, really cool African kind of reggae-ish kind of artist. So I wrote about him a lot in one of my essays. And that kind of stuff then helped me to see these reasons as to why actually I did like French, and why French is quite cool, and there's lots of cool stuff to explore. And again, another key feature at this point at degree level is that I had another week in France. It was a bit different here. It wasn't like an exchange where I was living with a family. It wasn't like work experience where I was working in a regular kind of linguistical environment. It was like a school, if you like, for the week. It was like a sort of French summer school, I guess you could call it. And so yeah, it was a bit different, but it was really, again, really beneficial. This was with the Open University, where we had like kind of sessions, kind of morning, then we had a lunch, then we had a session in the afternoon. Then in the evening, we got to choose of whether we went to extra sessions on grammar, culture, all of that stuff. They had films shown in the evening. We had an afternoon where we went out into the town and all of this. And this was at the time at least, this was in Caen. This was in the town that I'd done my work experience at when I was doing my A-levels. So that was quite a nice sort of full circle thing. And I think that's something as well that learning French has taught me, is that when you have those kind of moments, if you have something that you can sort of come full circle on, like maybe you go to a place now and then 3, 5, 10 years down the line you visit again and you just see how you experience it differently. You just kind of acknowledge all of that. Or maybe it's not even a place, maybe it's just, you know, a film that you watch, and then you watch it at another point in time and you've learned more of the language and you think, okay, how am I enjoying this differently now? You know, what do I know that's different? When you have something that you can come full circle on, I think that's a really nice aspect of language learning as well, that French has definitely taught me. In terms of time span, like I said, started in primary school, but from then to now, it's definitely not been 20 plus years of like focused like French study the whole time. So I would say, including everything, if you include school as like more focused time, probably looking at like 10 years of focused French study time and then 10 years of just like passive, it being a part of my life. So yeah, that's the rough time span, but I think it's hard to measure things by years, and it's certainly hard for me to measure French in terms of hours, because that's a big estimation. It would be thousands of hours at this point. Best tools then. So what tools have I used that really have helped? Like I said, those grammar drills, like that boring repetitive stuff, has always been useful. In school, this was the form of vocab, where we would get given a vocab list. Even up to A level, we'd get given a list of vocab we'd have to learn frantically for next time, and that was really boring. But I'm glad I kind of put in that groundwork at the beginning, because then now, and the same with the grammar drills, because then now I can kind of focus on the more fun stuff. So I would say more recently, the best tool that really kind of helped to reignite like a passion for French outside of just education, if you like, would probably be Stromae. So it probably doesn't sound like a typical tool, and it's not, because Stromae is a human, and Stromae is just like a fantastic musician, fantastic at everything that he does, but in particular it just made me look at French in this new light. I'd not, at that point when I found Stromae, I'd not yet found that, like, I call it finding your Shakira, because for me Shakira was that for Spanish, and I think maybe Stromae has proven to be that for me for French, that thing that just captures you and kind of lures you in to keep going and to keep learning. So yeah, music tends to come back for me in terms of tools. What worked? You know, it's hard for me to say what worked with French, because I think so much of what I know was already founded before I had a sort of more conscious role to play in that. So it's hard for me to say. So I'd have to say that what worked with French would be time and exposure. So time, just in terms of being relaxed about it. At first, just learning because, you know, I was learning at school, and then just keeping learning because I was always doing something. There was always a reason, like when I've been learning, like school, A-levels, degree, blah, 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 you know. So time and patience obviously goes along with that. And then exposure, again, things like going there and doing the work experience, doing the exchanges, doing the summer school, things like enjoying elements of French culture like Stromae. So that all counts as exposure. So time and exposure, I think, is what French has proven that works for me. And finally, what would I do differently learning French? I'd say that maybe later on, I'd give grammar more attention. So there are still gaps in my French grammar and in my, like, the basic stuff like pronunciation that you think like, oh yeah, you learn it, then you know it, and then that's it. There are still little gaps in that because I was never taught that sort of stuff from the beginning. I was just taught like in primary school fashion, and then in, like, you know, it got to a point, I would say like A level, where it's just, oh, you know this stuff. Obviously you do, because you've been learning throughout secondary school, right? But for me, I hadn't, because I'd had those 2 years where, like, I started and it was just the same repetitive stuff. So I'd say that, like, more of a focus on like the grammar stuff, especially as it got then later and I was becoming more advanced, when I could actually go back and look at that stuff and really be honest with myself about where my weaknesses are. And it's still something that I can do to this day, so I'm not too worried about that. What about you? Have you ever studied French? What's your story? Share in the comments down below. And remember, as I said at the start of this video, there is a free training waiting for you called How to Find Time to Learn a Language, even if you're crazy busy. You can sign up at the link in the description below. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So be sure to subscribe to this channel for regular language learning videos, and tap the little bell as well so that you get them pop up in your feed. And I will see you very soon. Thank you. Au revoir.